Make sure I'm recording. And this is session number 16 in Biblical Backgrounds. I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm joined by my friends in the Philippines and in Italy and around the US. We're studying today backgrounds for the portion of history that we call the Babylonian captivity and the intertestamental period. Just roughly from 600 BC until the time of Christ. And there's a whole bunch of material for that era. I'm going to go rather quickly through it because most of it is very well known and it's easily accessible. There are some things that come up new, but relatively little is coming up brand new for this whole period. We've got a lot of information, but we don't need to go over all of it. So we're going to go through that today. Let's see what we've got. I'll share the screen and we'll talk about the Babylonian exile at the time of Jeremiah. Let's see, that would be this one, which I'm sharing. And is it going to work? Yes, it's going to work. Okay, here's a shot of Jerusalem. It's actually 3 shots stitched together. This is from back in the day when if you wanted to have a panoramic shot of a scene, instead of taking your cell phone out and just scanning and letting the computer do all the work. This was done with film. I was standing on the Mount of Olives and took 3 shots of Jerusalem from the one point. And then later on, when this was scanned into the computer, I stitched it together. And as you can see, the stitching together is never quite perfect. It's just difficult to do. Anyway, that's panorama of Jerusalem. That's the Kidron Valley, and we're looking over at the old city of Jerusalem with the modern city of Jerusalem in the background. The white color of Jerusalem is caused by the particular limestone that's used for construction there. This was limestone from a quarry, well, actually several quarries in the immediate vicinity of Jerusalem up in the hills. And it's a whitish yellow, very pretty and very hard stone. And today, inside the city limits of Jerusalem, every building, every permanent building is required to be faced with Jerusalem stone. So you don't see odd colors. People don't put up wooden buildings and paint them green. Everything is Jerusalem stone. And that gives Jerusalem this consistent, bright white color. And that was true in antiquity as well, because the white stone was readily available. They could get it everywhere. Okay, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. First time it was destroyed. It had been sacked by Shishak, the Egyptian, in 930 BC. But 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came back a third time. We know from the story of the prophets that his first trip was in 606 BC, and he surrounded the city, made threats, and ran off with the nobility of the Jerusalem government. The best of the young men were taken off to Jerusalem, or off to Babylon, where they were given a Babylonian education. But That's a part of the larger plan that Nebuchadnezzar had to build an empire. Instead of just simply going places and destroying everything and running off with loot, which is what the Assyrians would do, Nebuchadnezzar tried to sell a soft kind of imperialism. Nebuchadnezzar had things to offer. So when he came to Jerusalem in 606, he was definitely a tyrant, imposing an empire that the people of Jerusalem didn't particularly want. But he was trying to make it as attractive as possible because he believed that a multinational empire with a common economy could be more prosperous for everybody than a bunch of little independent states. And on a secular level, that's quite true. We all know in the modern world that there is strength in numbers and in mass, and that there's something good about that. There's also something dangerous. There's a great deal that can be quite unbiblical, quite evil about an imperial movement. At any rate, Nebuchadnezzar was trying to build an empire, and so he took the young nobility away from Jerusalem, took them to Babylon. Daniel was among that group, and Nebuchadnezzar imposed a tame Jew named Gedaliah to be the governor of the province of Judah. And those that he took back to Babylon, he was hoping would grow up to be the leaders of Judah, who would be subservient to Babylon. And it didn't work all that well. Another one of Nebuchadnezzar's principles was that he would escalate. So his second trip in 597, when the Jews rebelled again, involved the exiling of the middle class, artisans, merchants, craftsmen of various sorts. The middle class of the Jerusalem society, they were taken off. Ezekiel went with that group. This left in Jerusalem and in Judea only the peasants. There were very few people left. By 586 BC, the last of the Jews present in Jerusalem rebelled again, which was really not a very smart move. Jeremiah counseled the leaders of the time to surrender. And because of that, Nebuchadnezzar thought that Jeremiah was a good guy, and he was actually treated somewhat better than the others. Gedaliah himself was assassinated, and the survivors of the final destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC were mostly sent off into exile in Egypt. Jeremiah was probably forced to go to Egypt against his will. The whole region, all of Judah, was left unpopulated. One of Nebuchadnezzar's policies was to not repopulate a place with aliens. So unlike the Assyrians, who would force people into random exile, which is what he did with the Northern Kingdom, those people were simply told to get out, go away. They went somewhere often widely dispersed all over the Assyrian Empire and any place else they could get to, which would be Eastern Europe, Central Asia, all over the place. Those people were absorbed into the surrounding nations and have frankly disappeared. The Jews of Jerusalem and the immediate area were kept together. They were allowed to form a separate community in Babylon. And Jerusalem and Judah, having been destroyed, were simply left barren. The place was not repopulated. In some very important ways, that serves the prophetic outlook. It was God's intention that the people, after 70 years, prophesied by Jeremiah, Jeremiah 25:10, 70 years will be the time of the exile. After 70 years, the people of Judah could come back and rebuild their land because nobody else had moved in, or very few people had moved in, and it was possible to get a fresh start. So a lot of important stuff going on there. And when we look at the walls of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount area, remember that Dome of the Rock wasn't there. The Al-Aqsa Mosque over by the south wall wasn't there. The roadway that follows around wasn't there. The walls themselves that you see here were mostly knocked down and rebuilt by Herod the Great, but then knocked down again by the Romans and rebuilt by Suleiman the Magnificent, a Muslim king. I guess he was a sultan in the 15th century. This is after the time of the Crusades. So Jerusalem has this enormous history from this one spot. If you were with me up on the Mount of Olives, I would point to places on this photograph with artifacts from every period between the present, the modern skyline with new hotels going up, all the way back for 5,000 years. I can show you 5,000 years of history in this one photograph. So quite an amazing place. Let's look at a map of the Babylonian Empire. Yeah, that'll work. This is the extent of the Babylonian Empire. You can see that it's mostly on the right. It includes Babylon, along with Sumer and Assyria, and a part of the Elamite territory, and then moving toward the west all the way up the Mesopotamian Valley. It runs down the coast of Lebanon and Syria and Israel, all the way to the borders with Egypt in the Sinai. That Sinai border changed from time to time. Possessions out in the Arabian desert were also very flexible, because the only way to secure a place like that is to send patrols out with camels. And there was, in fact, a road from Kedar to Babylon in biblical times, and that was used by camel caravans. And that's how the Arabian desert was held. A fellow by the name of Nabonidus was a son of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king at the time of Daniel, or of Daniel's death. Nabonidus was off in the Arabian desert somewhere on expedition when Babylon fell. We actually think we've found Nabonidus' army out in Egypt, someplace out in the Qattara Depression in Egypt, way out in the middle of literally nowhere, with camel bones and bits and pieces of armor. But you can see from this map, the Babylonian Empire is a relatively compact empire. It stretches from the southeastern corner of Turkey across the foothills of Urartu, which would be modern Armenia, and Kurdistan. It stretches along the full length of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, all of modern Iraq. And it controlled a bunch of small city-states along the Mediterranean coast. You'll see, if you look closely at this map, you can see the two big battles that secured the Babylonian Empire for Nebuchadnezzar. In the far north of the coastal route, you'll see Carchemish. The Battle of Carchemish happened in 609 BC. That's where the Assyrian army had its Waterloo. That was the end of the Assyrians. And this is the place where Josiah tried to stop Pharaoh Necho from getting in on the fun, and was killed for his efforts. It's too bad about Josiah, but the judgment was already coming. The other main battle is in 586 BC, the destruction of Jerusalem. Those two battles really defined the setup of the Babylonian Empire. We don't think of the Babylonian Empire as this major, widespread military force going everywhere, conquering and to conquer. They're more famous for the development of an administrative state. The theory of empire that Nebuchadnezzar invented is what we today call the melting pot. Bring everybody into Babylon, require them to learn the Babylonian language, to follow the Babylonian religion, to invest in Babylonian projects, and everybody will come in and everybody will become Babylonian. And their old cultures will be a part of their history that will be honored and respected, but no longer practiced. We call that the melting pot. So the United States is often thought of as a melting pot because people from all over the world come to the United States, and we expect them to learn American English, quite different from British English. We expect them to behave like Americans and learn to follow our laws and drive like Americans and all of the rest of it. Canada, just to our north, uses a different imperial theory, what we call the mosaic, where each nationality keeps its own national distinctives and forms an enclave or a territory where it does its thing. So British Columbia is a territory of Canada just to the north of us. And those folks mostly came from Scotland. So you get a whole lot of Scottish people, and they wear kilts, and they celebrate Scottish holidays, and it's kind of fun. Places like Vancouver are pretty international, but out in the sticks, you'll find a whole lot of Scottish holidays and celebrations. It's very good. My father emigrated from Scotland to British Columbia 100 years ago when he came over. Farther to the east, you've got the province of Quebec, with Toronto in it, which is the capital city of Canada. And it's French speaking. People immigrated from France to settle that territory, and they've remained French to this day. Completely different from the way Nebuchadnezzar would have set things up. Later on, we're going to see the Persian Empire. That's more of a mosaic empire. They wanted everybody to keep their own language and their own culture. That's why the people of Israel were sent back to Judah by the Persians. It's a different imperial philosophy. Okay, let's look at the next map. Ezekiel went with the exiles of 597, the middle class of Jerusalem, and he had a ministry in Babylon. His primary prophetic work was done in Babylon. His message was that judgment was going to continue to fall. He predicted the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. He said, but that eventually the nation will be restored. Ezekiel's message is essentially the same as Jeremiah, that destruction is coming, but restoration will happen by and by. The messages of all of the prophets, all of the major pre-exilic prophets, and post-exilic as well, have this same structure. Destruction is coming, or it has already come, but at the end of the age, Jerusalem will be rebuilt. Messiah will come again. The kingdom will be restored. These are elements of Old Testament prophecy that have to some extent been fulfilled. The first coming of Christ, of course, fulfills a whole lot of prophecy, but there is a second coming of Christ that is yet to come to fulfill the remainder of that prophecy. A lot of complex stuff. Ezekiel's prophecy of the dry bones in chapter 37 and of the rebuilt temple in chapters 40 through 48 are some of the most familiar and popular stories in the Old Testament. The dry bones is great fun. It's a whole bunch of dried up dead bones as of a great army that had been destroyed. And chapter 37 speaks of a joining together of the dead bones and then of the giving of life to those bones. And this would be literally fulfilled by the return of Israel to the land, and then by the return of Israel to the Lord. There are two parts to Israel's restoration. The simple fact that modern Israel exists in the land is not enough to fulfill the prophecy. We're also looking for a return of Israel to the Lord, a return to godliness. And that would include a reception of Christ as the Messiah. And that hasn't happened yet in any large-scale way. We're seeing some of the beginning steps of that. There is a Messianic Jewish movement in Israel, but it's not large, and it doesn't fulfill prophecy yet. That's what we're looking forward to. The prediction of a temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem is certainly not fulfilled by Zerubbabel when he came back in 525 BC. That little temple is nothing like what Ezekiel describes. It's certainly not fulfilled by Herod the Great, who was an Edomite, for heaven's sakes, and a Roman client. The Second Temple, as expanded by Herod, was quite different from what Ezekiel describes. The details of the temple that Ezekiel envisions appear to apply to the future messianic age, what we sometimes call the millennial kingdom. And Messiah himself will rule from Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem will be a fully operational temple with sacrifices and everything. This was not fulfilled by Herod's temple or by Zerubbabel's temple. It will also not be fulfilled really by the tribulation temple, which at this point looks like it could be a prefab, quick setup temple, more like a tabernacle than a temple. There are some who read Ezekiel 40 through 48 as an allegory of the church. And God bless them. I appreciate their efforts, but there really is no warrant for that position. The Millennial Temple can be understood as a literal temple yet to be built in Jerusalem. When that happens, it is very likely that this gigantic dome of the rock is going to have to be bulldozed. Years ago, I sent a note to President Netanyahu of Israel, volunteering to drive the Caterpillar tractor when the time came for that job to be done. I never did hear back from him. He probably gets that offer fairly regularly. Okay, Daniel was one of the noblemen. He left earlier than Ezekiel. Daniel went in 606. And Nebuchadnezzar was hoping for loyalty from the Judean vassals. Daniel and his friends were probably intended to be bilingual, two-language scribes for the king, to be able to translate edicts into the various local languages. So Nebuchadnezzar was planning on an empire that would last a very long time and would be a very impressive place. Daniel's ability to interpret dreams is a parallel to Joseph. The Babylonians, like other ancient royal houses, had wise men on staff who could interpret dreams, among other things. The Babylonian wise men would interpret dreams by looking at the components of the dream. O king, tell us your dream, and we'll tell you what it means. The Babylonian wise men were doing what modern counselors do with dream interpretation. You listen to the dream, then you talk to them about what's going on in your life right now, what sorts of things are troubling you by day, because these things are likely to come back in the night. Dream interpretation is nothing particularly mystical for the most part. Daniel's ability to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams was a completely different practice. Daniel didn't interpret on the bases that the professional wise men did. So the wise men objected to Daniel's work on technical and professional grounds. There's a kind of a professional jealousy. Daniel was introducing an entirely new technique, that of listening to the God of reality. There is a God in heaven who makes known the meaning of dreams. So the surroundings of Daniel in Babylon are actually quite well known today. This photograph on the left is a portion of the excavated ruins of Babylon. Parts of it have been rebuilt. The dictator Saddam Hussein was hoping to turn the ancient ruins of Babylon into a kind of a Disneyland style tourist attraction. I have difficulty believing that anybody would be attracted to modern Iraq to go to Disney World on Babylon. I mean, it seems crazy to me, but Saddam Hussein spent an awful lot of money trying to rebuild portions of Babylon. Didn't succeed. Among other things, he built a copy of the old Ishtar Gate. I want to show you the original Ishtar Gate. Let's see if I can stop this one. Okay, that worked. I'll make this go away, then I'll share again. This is too complicated. I liked it better when everything just worked. Okay, let's see here. Share. Oh, I think this is going to work. Yeah. All I have to do is find the thing. Okay. This is the museum in Berlin. Yeah, Berlin in Germany, that Berlin, where the Ishtar Gate is kept. This is absolutely an amazing thing. This is the entrance into the Ishtar Gate area in the Berlin Museum. There are actually half a dozen really wonderful museums on an island in the middle of Berlin. Some of this was badly damaged during the war, but frankly, even the British and American bombers tried to avoid destroying this section. Stuff was held underground. The Russians who took Berlin took a lot of these things back to Russia with them, but the Ishtar Gate was not among them. So that was reassembled after the war, and we can go and see it now in this museum. It's actually, seriously, I've done it twice. It's worth an actual trip to Berlin for nothing more than going to the museum island. I've been there twice and done nothing but go to the museums. It's really, really pretty neat. This is a portion of the throne room mosaic of Nebuchadnezzar. The museum guard on the left gives you a sense of the size of everything. Nebuchadnezzar's throne would have been on the level of the artistic trees in the middle ground. So he sat in the garden amongst all these flowering trees. At the very top are some birds, kind of artistic birds flying about in the upper branches of the garden. And down below are the wild beasts of the field, symbolized by the lions. So here is Nebuchadnezzar in the midst of this beautiful blue and gold and green tapestry of mosaic tile. And he rules over all the beasts of the field. The birds of the air are making nests in the trees above his head. And he rules the world from this magnificent throne. Now, of course, it's very significant that Daniel chapter 5 describes Nebuchadnezzar's dream about sitting under a tree and the birds of the air nesting in the branches and the beasts of the field, and then the angels coming down and chopping down the trees and driving off the birds, and Nebuchadnezzar going out and having the mind of a beast. The dream comes directly from this mosaic. This was Nebuchadnezzar's normal lifestyle. The Ishtar Gate looks a whole lot better in the real example than in the made-up example. The deep blues and purples of the tiles could only be achieved in antiquity. We know that the pigment for this kind of tile comes from cobalt, a rare earth mineral that we get from Central Asia. We know that, but modern tile makers have not been able to duplicate the colors. There seems to be some secrets that were held amongst the Central Asian tile makers that we just haven't been able to duplicate today. This is the original Ishtar Gate. It was taken apart in little chunks and carried to Berlin on wagons and railroad trains and barges, whatnot. It was a long, difficult journey, well over 100 years ago. And why they did it, I'm not entirely sure, except it does make a nice centerpiece for a museum. It's beautiful. This is another shot. You can just imagine the difficulty of moving this. This was a surrounding, genuinely beautiful and massive part of the architecture of the city of Babylon that Daniel would have experienced, and that Nebuchadnezzar was justly proud of. It's just big. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that one. Make this go away. All right, and we'll get back to the, sharing screens is actually kind of difficult. Let's see if I can make it go back to, let's see here. All right, there. Oh, there. There we go. Oh, this is not easy. Sometimes it's easier than other times. There we go. Back to Daniel and on. Few more pictures from Babylon. The death of Nebuchadnezzar in 562 BC led to a slow deterioration. Archaeology provides us quite a bit of background. We know that Nebuchadnezzar's son, Evil Merodach, reigned briefly, and he treated Jehoiakim of Judah kindly. Jehoiakim was in Babylon, and this comes from 2 Kings 25. We've got clay tablets found in Babylon that relate to the food supplies and other kindnesses given to Jehoiakim. And this particular one, and I'm not going to ask you to memorize that, but this particular clay tablet actually has Jehoiakim's name on it. So stuff that was provided for him. Evil Merodach was replaced after 2 years by Nabonidus, who is a really interesting character. The books typically call him enigmatic. So he's a mysterious character. He seems to have been devoted to the moon god Sin instead of the nature god Marduk. And he was very heavily involved in the reconstruction of the Temple of the Moon in Haran. So he allied himself with the Persian Cyrus for a while, and that didn't help. That eventually led to a downfall. In response to the Persian threat that Nabonidus felt, he moved to Arabia and left his son Belshazzar to run the country in his place. That was not a good idea. A past generation of scholars tended to deny that Belshazzar ever existed, since he's not mentioned anywhere as the last king. But recent discoveries have shown that Belshazzar was a kind of regent or crown prince. And when Daniel was offered the position, third in the kingdom. That would have been in line after Nabonidus first and Belshazzar second. So all of that we have on clay tablets from the period now. Nabonidus' absence from the capital would have been a very difficult thing for the priests of Marduk. The king, and only the king, was expected to do the duties of the Marduk religion, including sleeping with the selected priestesses at the time of the New Year's ceremony. Only the king could do that. And if Nabonidus wasn't present to do the fertility rites with the selected priestess, the result was floods and pestilence for the coming years. And morale must have been absolutely miserable in Babylon, because the Babylonians actually believed these things. They thought that this was true. Here's a picture on the left of the Babylonian priests of Marduk, who are very worried. All right, Daniel and the end of the empire. A little bit here. We know that Daniel was a major Babylonian official. And he watched the decline of Babylon after the time of Nebuchadnezzar. He was just there and watched everything wind down. The rise of Persia was predicted. And Daniel writes chapters 7 and 8 about the coming Persian invasion and victory. The march on Babylon happened in 539. He was probably greeted by much of Mesopotamia as a liberator. Numerous inscriptions have come down to give us evidence of his vast popularity. So here on the far left, you see the Persian king Cyrus defeating a lion. Maybe he actually went after lions, or maybe this is symbolic of the destruction of the lion of Babylon. Could be. On the right, you see the Persian king climbing up the mountains of the gods, surrounded by the priests of the various gods, in order to make sacrifice to whatever gods are up there. The clay tablet at the bottom dates to this period of the Persian takeover. So we've got lots and lots of background on this time. We know that what the Bible gives us as little details, as local color, is exactly accurate. We know what happened. It's actually quite clear. And the Bible gives us precisely accurate historical information to the extent that it does. Now, as the, let's see here. All right. The nature of the exile, kind of very interesting. When the people of Israel were sent off into exile in Babylon, the families were not torn apart. They were allowed to stick together, which was a really, really good thing. Whole villages seem to have been transplanted whole. And the exiles weren't cut off from home. I've got a telephone ringing in my background, and I'm not going to answer that call. Strange stuff happens. Somebody in Georgia is calling me. Anyway, family life was a really, really important thing. The exiles seem to have maintained connections with Jerusalem through much of this time. They were allowed a freedom of worship but they couldn't build a new temple. There was no new temple. The picture on the right here is a part of a reconstructed village in northeastern Israel in the Golan Heights, a place called Katzrin. The center of any Jewish home was the kitchen. And here's the kitchen stove with a place to cook bread. The little guy with the pot on top is a place to cook bread. The pottery for mixing a meal is in the background. This was an extremely common sight. Ordinary villages had gone off into exile. When they came back, they stayed together. The other thing that is significant about the Babylonian exile, I think probably the most important thing, is the synagogue. The exiles were allowed to do their religion, but there's no temple. So they began to build synagogues. A synagogue, the Greek word synagogos, means a gathering. That's all it means. If 10 Jewish men get together to pray, they can declare themselves a synagogue. That's a minyan. Ezra and Ezekiel both indicated that the study of the law could be an acceptable substitute for sacrifice. And so they began to study the law, the books of Moses. The synagogue was a group of men and their families who would meet eventually in a building that's built for the purpose to pray and study and worship together. And this photo on the left is a synagogue, again at Katzrin, built in the basilica style with pillars and a central aisle and two aisles on the side. At the far end, you can see a little platform. The scroll of the Torah was kept there, and a pulpit. And from the pulpit, the elders would read the Torah, and the president of the synagogue or a rabbi, if they had one, would explain the meaning of the passage that had been read. So the synagogue was made up of the reading of scripture, the teaching of biblical concepts, prayer, and song. In the synagogues, the Psalms were sung. That's the pattern on which the early church was founded. The early church was built on the synagogue. So prayer, reading of scripture, a sermon, and music were the key elements. The church added the Lord's Supper, which is a communal family-style meal during the church service. All of this is hearkening back to the Jewish tradition that developed during the Babylonian exile. It's a pretty neat thing. Okay. Where did they live? Among other places, they lived in Egypt. A lot of the Jews went to Egypt. So we've got some places like this one on the left is called Elephantine. And Elephantine comes from the Greek name for the place because the granite boulders in the middle of the Nile in this place looked to the Greeks like elephants in the water. So they named it Elephantine. The Jews who lived here had a different name for it, and I've forgotten it. But there was quite a large number of exiles who ended up in Egypt, and we've got a lot of their letters and documents. Jeremiah may have been at Elephantine. It's hard to know. We don't know exactly. During this period, the Jewish rabbis and the scribes began to compile the most significant Jewish writing outside of the Old Testament. This is the Talmud. This photo on the right is a page of the Babylonian Talmud. In the center of the page, actually the right-hand side center of the page, is a passage from Moses. Just a couple of words, actually, that are going to be commented on. And then there are some comments by the rabbis, the oldest layer of rabbis. Then around the next circle out is additional commentary collected from other great and well-known rabbis. So the rabbi would introduce this thing. You have heard that it was said, thus and such and so, you shall not commit murder. But I say unto you, so and so and so and so and so and so. And if you say to yourself, why, that sounds just like Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount, you would be right. Jesus was acting the part of the rabbi, explaining the meaning of the law and expanding on the meaning of the law. The difference being that while the rabbis had no authority except for their learning, Jesus spoke as one having authority. So there's a foundation that we're going to get into the New Testament. Okay. The restoration of Judah takes place under the Persians, and here's some Persian background. This is Persepolis, up in the northern part of Persia. I think this is Persepolis. Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah are set against a Persian background. These are some of the last little bits of the Old Testament. Cyrus was the first of the Persian kings, and his successors built an absolutely enormous empire, much larger than the previous Babylonian Empire. And the theory of empire for the Persians is the mosaic, as opposed to the Babylonian melting pot. The book of Ezra preserves 2 copies of a proclamation made specifically for the Jewish people. In Ezra 2, we get the report of a migration of 50,000, maybe 50 families, maybe 50 villages. We don't know. None of it seems to work very well. The really big numbers are always a problem in the Old Testament. There was resistance from the Samaritans and other groups, 525 BC, and it took some 20 years to rebuild the temple. Darius the Great later on introduced a number of innovations in the handling of empire. Among other things was the Persian Royal Road, 1,700 miles from Susa in Persia to Arbela, and later all the way across Asia Minor to Sardis. Horseshoes were invented by the Persians to allow the horses to travel faster. Mail delivery was invented by the Persian Empire. There's an old story that people think refers to modern mailmen. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. That was first spoken concerning the Persian mail delivery system. That's 2,500 years ago, so long time ago. And I suspect that their mail delivery was almost as quick as ours most of the time. Their horses were relatively close together. They went on horseback from place to place very quickly with leather bags with the mail and all over the empire. They have a map of the Persian Empire. You can see the original Babylonian Empire is just a central part. In the north, the Persian Empire extended all the way to the southern half of the Black Sea, all of Turkey, all the way up into Macedonia. They finally came up against the Greeks in Greece. In the east, the Persian Empire extends all the way to the borders of India. It includes most of Afghanistan, most of Pakistan, were parts of Persia. North on the eastern side of the Caspian Sea, up into the lands of Central Asia. Persian Empire goes south all the way along the Persian Gulf. And then all of Mesopotamia and all of Israel, Syria, but farther south into Egypt and North Africa. The Persian Empire was a genuinely enormous empire. It lasted for a long time. It will finally come down to an end around 330 BC. Some key places, Persepolis, Susa, and Ecbatana. We've got Persepolis and Susa are places where Esther and Nehemiah record. And Ecbatana is a part of the province of Media, where a scroll of Ezra 6 was found. So we know the Jews were in all of these places, and they were an important part of what's going on in Persia. King Xerxes has left behind a whole bunch of stuff. The Bible is fairly silent after the end of the exile, down until 583 BC, and the story of Esther. Xerxes is the Greek version of the Hebrew transliteration Ahasuerus, which is in turn an attempt at something unpronounceable in the Old Persian. I've transliterated it as something like Kasha Ayarsta. And it's unpronounceable for my mouth. But the banquet that we see in Esther 1 may well have been designed to get military leaders together for planning an attack on Greece. The Battle of Marathon happened in 490 BC, 7 years before this. Xerxes was looking for vengeance. He actually marched on Greece in about 480 BC, in between chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Esther. His line took him through a pass called Thermopylae, where a body of a few thousand Greek defenders from Sparta in Greece held off the entire Persian army until a traitor revealed a back route where they could be flanked. Xerxes sent his trained group of soldiers through that route, and the big battle. 300 Spartans refused to abandon the pass, and the immortals attacked them and, of course, killed them all, but gave the Athenians long enough to set up a defense. The Battle of Salamis was a naval battle farther south, out in the Aegean Sea. The Persians were lured into shallow water where they couldn't maneuver, and the smaller Greek ships picked them off one at a time. The battle between Greeks and Persians is mentioned regularly in the Old Testament. The predictions of the king of Persia and the king of Greece doing battle with one another in the book of Daniel is actually emphasized by the history that we know to this day. Okay, that was Esther and Xerxes. This is a view of the Persian Palace in Persepolis, which is probably the place where Esther held court. And these are Persian satraps and important people on the right. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah give us a few details about the return of the exiles and the rebuilding of the walls of the city. This set of ruins in the background is a very, very old synagogue that was actually destroyed in 1949 by the Jordanians during the Israeli War of Independence. The line of Nehemiah's wall is not entirely known. We've got some ideas, but not quite enough. It roughly followed Solomon's line, but there's a lot we don't know. It's about a fourth of the size of the city from Hezekiah's day. So today it's covered up by elements of the Temple Mount and parts of the city of David and some other stuff. This is a part of the modern old city of Jerusalem that we see at that time. And here we have pictures of Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah is the boy in the middle, and no, not really. These are kids in Jerusalem. Into the New Testament, we're going to see the coming of Alexander the Great. This is a mosaic. These are two details of the mosaic in the Naples Museum that was found at Pompeii. So those of you in Italy might want to visit Naples sometime just to see this. It's in the Naples Archaeological Museum. Alexander the Great is this character on the left. Around 330 BC, he fought a series of battles against the Persians. One of the greatest was at Issus in Asia Minor. And the character on the right toward the top of the image is the Persian king running away from the angry Alexander. The Persian Empire was controlling the whole Middle East. And the embodiment of Western power was really Greece. So Greece is the West and Persia is the East. And where they come together is this conflict between Alexander and Xerxes. Yeah, Alexander is a fascinating character. I'm going to show you his empire. This again looks at the whole Middle East, and you can see that Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire eventually. Along the way, Alexander set up the principles for the construction of a Greek empire, and it didn't really ever happen. Alexander died at the height of his power. He had gone all the way to the borders of India and his generals told him that this is crazy. They need to turn back. So they came back, and eventually Alexander died, and his four generals split up the empire. That again is predicted by the book of Daniel. The yellowish color is the Seleucid Empire. The kind of pinkish color is the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, with a dividing line more or less in the middle of this, depending on the time period. So the king of the north is going to be the Seleucid kingdom empire area of Greece, which would include Syria, Mesopotamia, Turkey. And when the Old Testament speaks about the king of the north, this is what that means. The king of the south would be the Ptolemaic king. So Ptolemy and Seleucus, the two kings of Greece, generals who became kings, who are important in this intertestamental period. As a result of all that Alexander did, the Greek language and culture came to dominate the Mediterranean world. The Greek culture is symbolized by its architecture. All over the Greek world, the Mediterranean world, we find Greek temples. This particular temple is found in southern Italy at a place called Paestum, south of Naples. This photograph on the left is a Greek papyrus. The use of papyrus to write was invented by the Egyptians, but the Greeks took it to great lengths. This is a portion of the New Testament in Greek. The Septuagint was also written on papyrus. The Greek language became the common language of the entire ancient world. At the time of Christ, the whole world understood enough Greek to get around. It was the trade language of the world. And that's because of Alexander. There's a brief time in all of history when that was true. At the time of Christ, the Romans, of course, spoke Latin, but they also spoke Greek because they wanted to be understood. It was a leveler. Okay, the Ptolemaic rule of Palestine is kind of interesting. The Septuagint, this is a fragment of an early Septuagint manuscript. This was actually commissioned by Ptolemy II around 300 BC. He wanted a translation of the whole Bible, which would be the Old Testament at that time, into Greek. We call it the Septuagint. It's actually a Latin phrase. Septuaginta means the 70. And the old tradition is that there were 70 Jewish scholars who spent 70 days translating their Bible and produced 70 identical copies of the Old Testament. That's, of course, not true. There's no possibility that that's true. We actually have manuscripts from this very early level of the Septuagint translations, and they disagree with one another, depending on who translated. And those translations are extremely valuable for us today. They're very important for textual criticism of the Hebrew and for understanding how the later Vulgate ought to be understood. Very, very important stuff. At any rate, Alexander died, And Ptolemy translated the Septuagint. The Seleucids ruled over Palestine. And it's during this period that we see one of the most interesting bits of history. In the lower left-hand corner is a thing called the Rosetta Stone. It was found at a place in Egypt in the Nile Delta called Rosetta. And this has three different kinds of writing. The very top level is hieroglyphics, which is the ancient Egyptian form. In the middle is a kind of a Greek translation or transliteration of the hieroglyphic that we call demotic. And the bottom level is an actual translation into Greek. And the scholars who found this were French scholars who went along with Napoleon way back in the early 1800s. And they found the Rosetta Stone, and they immediately recognized that the bottom third of the stone was written in Greek, and they could read Greek. They used the Greek to make sense of the demotic. Once they had understood the demotic, they could go to the hieroglyphics and begin to make sense of the picture writing of the ancient Egyptians. This unlocked the hieroglyphics of the entire Egyptian world. That was a major thing. So when you hear people talk about the Rosetta Stone, that's what they're talking about. The little scarab beetle with all the hieroglyphics on it is an example of hieroglyphics. Okay. The Hasmoneans. After the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Seleucid kings, the last of the Seleucid Greek kings, there was a brief period when the Jews were sort of independent, not really, but sort of independent. They had their own kings, but there was a tension during this time between the Jews who wanted to be Greek and those who wanted to be traditional Hebrew. These folks are called the Hellenists, who wanted to be Greek, and the Hasidim, which means sort of holy ones. They were the ones who wanted to hold to the traditional. And these folks who called themselves Hasidic later on became the Pharisees of New Testament times. So everything has got, everything has a long history to it. In 129 BC, a fellow by the name of John Hercanus had pretty much solidified an independent Jewish rule. It was more or less independent under a larger Roman world. The Romans were the de facto rulers of the world, but the Jews had a somewhat independent thing going. The Pharisees continued to demand traditional practices, and they were the major political party at the time of Christ. John was succeeded by Alexander Jannaeus, who in turn was succeeded by his widow, Alexandra. Alexandra admitted the Pharisees to the Sanhedrin, which is really important. After her death in 67, there was a big turmoil about a successor, and that's when the Romans stepped in to make peace. That's when the Herod family begins to be the ruling power in Israel. So we see here Herod's corner post. That's the corner of the Temple Mount built by Herod the Great. And these fellas are the modern Hasidic Jews or Pharisees. They're called ultra-Orthodox, or they're called a variety of things. To me, they look like the Blues Brothers. This photograph was taken in Jerusalem from a balcony. I saw these fellows walking past, and so I shot them, of course. As we say goodbye to the intertestamental period, I should make a note about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Roman rule of Palestine was part of the much, much larger thing that we call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. By the time that the Romans ruled the world, Rome had shifted from a republic to an empire, which was not a good thing. And for all practical purposes, Rome was going to rule the world until roughly 600 AD. The Decapolis, 10 cities within the Roman provinces of the East, were granted independence during this period. At the same time, the Nabateans resisted Roman rule until we've got trouble with Antipater, one of the Herods. And that happened in 48 AD when Julius Caesar became the emperor, and Antipater volunteered to help make peace in Judea. Antipater's sons, Herod and Phasael, were made governors, and Herod found himself fighting gangs of bandits and zealots and the rest. And Herod the Great was the sole governor from 41 AD until about the time of the birth of Christ, 4 BC. A lot of the major building projects of Israel are credited to Herod the Great, particularly the Temple Mount and the mosque in Hebron. But here at Qumran, the Essenes got away from it all and began collecting scrolls. The one on the right is the Great Isaiah Scroll. The entire book of Isaiah, virtually identical to our modern printed copies of Isaiah, was buried in a cave in the Dead Sea region of Qumran by the Essenes and left there to be discovered at the time of the return of the Jewish people from their long exile in the rest of the world in 1947. And that's pretty much going to take us full circle. This takes us up to the life of Christ. On Wednesday, we'll start looking at some of the background material for the New Testament. So I'm going to quit there. As always, there's a lot of stuff to look at. There's a tremendous amount of material out there for people to, have the time to dig online and look for archaeological stuff and historical background. There's a ton of it. This gives you just a flavor of all that's out there. The Bible, Old and New Testament, is set against a real world background. It's not a novel. It's not myth. The Bible doesn't start out once upon a time. It starts out in the beginning. And it is primarily a work of history. So it's important for us to know that and to stand on that. What we teach when we teach the Bible is honest to goodness truth. This really happened to real people in a real place, and all the connections tie it all together. We'll get back on Wednesday and continue this. We'll get back to the whole background of the time of Christ, background for particularly the spread of the church. Again, there's a whole slop bucket full, as my son-in-law likes to say, of archaeology and historical background, all kinds of stuff to look at. I'll be sending you all a set of maps for the stuff that we'll be doing on Wednesday. So bye-bye, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks,
Bye now.
Dr.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, you guys.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Oscar. Bye, Don.
Bye, Don.
Bye-bye, Joyce.
Grazie.
Alexander, okay. Yeah, and Brother Joel, good to see you, my friend. Hi, Roger.
Oh.
Good to see you.
Grazie,